Hi everyone, my name is Dominic Arjado. I'm a web developer, and these are guides, tips, and tricks to web development. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to build your own swiper, or also known as carousel or slider, in React and TypeScript. And you also learn how to write tests for it using JS and testing library. So in my early days of web development, I actually didn't know how to build one, and have to use a third-party library to add it in my web projects. But now, as I gain more experience and knowledge in web development, I've learned how to build one of my own. And that's why I'm sharing this knowledge with you guys. And there's some advantage to that in learning how to build your own component. First is that you don't sacrifice the bundle size, because when you use a third-party library, there are some features that you don't actually need. And if you don't use it, then it just adds unnecessary size to your bundle. And second, so for example, you have to follow the expected design from your designer, for example. The third-party library may not have all the customizations that you require to achieve that expected design. And you have to override those styles. And again, it brings back to point number one, which again adds size to the bundle. And third, and I think this is the most important part, is you become less dependent on third-party libraries, and it will give you knowledge and confidence to build one of your own, or even extend this Swiper component. And maybe eventually you also need this knowledge that you've gained and build another component which might be related to Swiper. So yeah, if you're interested, follow me along, and I highly suggest that you write code with me. I think that's the most effective way of learning, at least for me. And yeah, let's get started. So yeah, let me just quickly show you what we'll be achieving by the end of this video. So this is a very simple swiper component. So basically there's current image being displayed, the first image, and there's some indicators over here. So basically shows you how many images we have on this swiper. And I can do a mouse drag. So I click first, and you see that the images will follow my mouse cursor. So once I let go, it will move to the next image, and so forth to until the last image. And I can't do any swipe anymore, but I can go back. I can go back and swipe back. And I can also use these indicators to basically do the same thing, but with less effort. And yeah, and this also works in mobile. So let me just show you in Chrome's device toolbar. This is the Chrome's device toolbar to toggle it. And you can see this is actually a swipe. I mean a touch screen. It's recreating that touch action. And yeah, it works fine as well. All right, so I also add the link to the description below for these 5 images that we'll be using. And yeah, to quickly get started with React and TypeScript, you go on, we're gonna use create React app. And there's this TypeScript template, and let's just copy this. And I already run this in my terminal because it will take some time to install all the packages. So basically just replace my app with the name of our project. So I'm going to use React TypeScript Swiper, and just press enter, and it will install all the packages for you. So I already done that. So I'm just going to open it in my IDE. So I'm using Visual Studio Code as my IDE. So you can also use that, because I'm using some of the extensions such as Prettier, ES7 snippets. Oops, sorry about that. And yeah, important part is the Prettier, because it automatically format the code for us. And I have this VS Code settings over here under .vs code folder and settings.json. So you can copy this as well if you like. And this is the Prettier config. And once you download all the images, these 5 images, put them under the public folder over here. All right, let me just make this bigger. And you can open your terminal on VS Studio Code by pressing Command tick. And then let's run our React app. Yarn start. So a couple of assumptions right here. I assume you have some basic knowledge in web development and React and Yarn, npm install, all that. But if you're new to TypeScript and JS, and that's fine, I'm going to guide you along the way. And yeah, you will open my browser and open the app, which is running on port 3000. Right, so everything is working fine as expected. And let's make some code changes. So this one, we don't need it. For the apps.css, we also don't need it. We don't need the logo. Oops, sorry. Delete this. For the index.css, we don't need this code style, but we need to add style for every element to make it border box. So basically, if we define a width or height, it will follow that exact pixels. It will, even if there's padding, borders, margin, all that. And then for app.css, let's make the changes to the component. So let's name this as container. We don't need the logo. For the container, I want the width to become 100% with a max width of 800 px and basically just some padding. All right. Oh, we also need it to be centralized. And I think that's about it. And usually when I create components, I put it under a components folder. So I created a folder here, and let's create Swiper.tsx. So you may have noticed this is how we write a TypeScript file in React. So instead of just JXX, we're going to use TSX. So it's a TypeScript template in React. And I'm going to use the snippets to automatically write the code for me. Swiper. And let's add a class name over here. Let's have it Swiper container. And unordered list with a class of Swiper list. And we also need a style for it. So I'm creating a Swiper.tsx and import it over here. Okay, so for the Swiper container, I want it to have a width of 100% and max width of also 100%. Overflow. So basically, you will have a scroll bar if it exceeds more than the width. For the Swiper list, this will become flex. So basically, if you see here, these are all ordered in displayed as flex. So all of these items will be displayed as flex. And if the images is too small for the container, at least we have the Swiper list as minimum 100%. So the image will occupy 100% of the container. And for this, we also have the direction of the flex to be instead of vertically arranged, it's horizontally arranged. And what else can we say? This style, none. Oops. Here. Padding should be 0 because unordered list has a default padding as well as margin. So we don't need that. So if you look at our app, there's nothing to see yet because we haven't added anything, just the div and the UL. So later you'll get to see something in a bit. So let's just code for now. Now I'm going to create SwiperItem.tsx. Then using the snippet, this should be li. So list item. This This is swiper item. Then this is image. So basically the image, individual image of our swiper. So let's have the source and alternative text as empty for now. And this will be swiper image. Again, we'll create a style for it as well and import it. SwiperItem.tsx. Have this as, again, with 100%. And it should not shrink. So flex shrink is 0. So for example, here, image already occupies 100%. If there's another image, it will not be reduced to 100%. It will still be 100%. So that's why we have the flex shrink over here. And then for the image itself, we just want it to be 100%. We hide auto so that it doesn't look disproportionate. It will scale accordingly to the based on the width. And we also don't want the select. So if you, for example, do this like kind of selection, it will not turn the image into highlighted image. So that's why we have user select none. All right, so currently this swiper item is not reusable yet, but how to make it reusable? Basically accepts the props. So image source and image alternative text. So as you can see, there's a squiggly error over here. That's actually from TypeScript. So this, if you're new to TypeScript, this is your first lesson. So you can just implicitly import a props, which is not defined in the type. So to define a type for a component, so just semicolon, and since it's an object, we're also going to use object and the name of the key along with its type. So source is a string, alternative text is also a string. All right, and we're going to use this here and over here. So in TypeScript, you can actually create a what they call a type alias. So basically an object having a name. So I'll name this as type props. It's like declaring a variable in JavaScript. Same way in TypeScript, you can define a type that you can reuse. So I'll just copy this and replace it like this. All right, and I can even create a file over here, name it types, and copy this, and this SwiperItem props. SwiperItem type, and export it, and I can use it over here, SwiperItem type. So the reason why I put it in the types folder so that I can reuse it even in our SwiperItem, which what I'm going to do right now. So also this one, the type props. Sorry, I want to export this as well. Reason why I'm exporting the props is that we'll be using it in our test later on. So yeah. So same thing over here, but for our swiper, it actually accepts an array of images. So we'll have it at items. So find the type. So again, we'll have an error because it's not defined in our type yet. So let's define it. So in TypeScript, you can wrap array in an array interface. So basically, this will be an array of, remember we created this, we can reuse it over here. So SwiperItem type. So basically, items are an array of swiper type. So basically, array of this object right here, which is an image source and other things, both are text. All right. So I hope that wasn't confusing. So here, I'm just going to loop the items. So this is an item, and I'll be using the index as the key. And let's use our SwiperItem. Let's just pass the item, which is the swiper item type, as the props for swiper item, and index as the key. All right. So I think that's about it. Now we're ready to use this in our app component. So I'll just import Swiper over here. And as you can see, if I didn't pass anything, TypeScript would complain. So you can already see the benefits of using TypeScript because I didn't pass items. So that will throw an error. So let's create the items. Remember the images right here. We're going to use them right now. So I'm just going to copy my code so that it's faster. So right here, this is the picture number 1 to 5, and I added an alternative text. And I'm just going to pass that as a props to our swiper item. So now we should see something in our app. So here you go. And there's a scroll bar because we exceeded the 100% of the swiper container. So as you can see, if I use a scroll bar, I can swipe to the end of the images. So what do we do now next? So before we write the code for that, let me just explain you what we're going to do. So basically, we'll be having a listener, so a mouse event listener. So by the time I click the mouse down, I will record that X position. So you know, in a Cartesian plane, sorry, I'm using a mathematics term. There's a y-axis and an x-axis. So x-axis is the horizontal position, while the y-axis is the vertical part of the Cartesian plane. So we'll just focus on the x-axis. That's how you actually move the items from left to right or vice versa. So you see that the x position would change from 0 to something negative because when moving from right to left, it's actually decreasing in the x-axis. So that's how we're going to move the images basically. So in our swiper component, we're going to define the state that basically change the position of the images. So the style for that would be transform 3D. So we didn't use transform X. You could actually use that, but popular third-party libraries that has a swiper, they use transform 3D, I think because of performance. So we're going to use that as well. Okay, and yeah, before we go into editing swiper component, let's create a folder called library or lib. And I'm going to add hooks over here. So I'm going to create some hooks helper for us so that it is much cleaner in our code. And also it will be easier for us to write tests for it. So I'm going to import useRef over here. Ref object. In React, we have different kinds of hooks. So one is useRef. So basically you can store the DOM elements to it, or you can also store variables. So in order for that to access those useRef, you have to execute ref.current. So get ref value. So how do you get the value of the ref? Basically, you can ref.current. So now I have this error right here from TypeScript. So in order to solve this, I'm going to use one of TypeScript features, which is called a generics. So generics is like the way for you to define a variable that you can use. So this ref will have a type of ref object from React. This is a custom type defined by React, the way we custom define this swiper item type. And this accepts a T. So this is again another generic. So I'm just going to use C. This letter right here can be anything actually. It doesn't have to be C. It can be like current or something, but in shorter, you can just use a single letter. capitalized, and the type of C will then be returned as the current. So why am I doing this? It's because, for example, I define a ref, let's say number ref, and then I use ref, right, as 0. So when I get the number, I'm passing ref from the getRef function that I created. So inside this getRef is the current, which is the value 0. So actually, it will be easier for me to just use over here. Sample component. As you can see right here, I pass the number ref, and now that when I hover onto the number, the type is a number. So same thing if I pass a string, then it will be a string. So that's the benefit of using generics. So basically, whatever the type you're passing on the useRef, we can still get the same type as the return value. So that's why I have this helper component right here. So another helper that I'm going to create is basically use state with a ref, right? So this accepts a default value. Again, we use generic so that you let the users define your type. Since default value can be anything, it can be number, string. Again, that's why we use a generic over here. So default value can be anything. So I'm using S. And then same way you define a state. First, value is the default value. Oops, forgot to use this ref over here. And again, we have state. So instead of just set state, I'm going to add an underscore right here. You'll get to know why. Import useState from React. Again, default value is the default value passed by our function. I'm going to create a set state function over here. Call the set state with the value. The value is again same type as our default value. So that's why you can already see the benefits of using generics. You get to reuse whatever the type is being passed over here. All right, and then this would overwrite the value. And let's just return it the same way useState is being returned. So you see state, set state, and then we'll just add the ref as the third argument. I mean the third item in the array. So state, set state, and then the ref. All right. So you can also add a type to the return. So semicolon. So it's an array of S with a function that accepts the value as S, which is just void. And the ref is a ref object, which is the type of S. All right. So I hope that wasn't too difficult to understand. Anyway, this is not the main topic of our video, so you can take your time to understand this part. So the reason why I created useState ref is basically I don't have to create this useRef again and again. It just basically I can immediately use the ref, which has the same value as the state. And why do I use ref? For example, you have a function that you need the value of the state. If you want to access the latest value of the state, you can use ref. So why not use state? Because you will recreate that function, which is not efficient. And so when you access ref, it's more efficient. Yeah. Okay, so going into the Swiper item. let's use the useStat rate. All right, and this will be 0. So remember how do we move the images using the X offset? This as offset X, set offset X, and this is the offset X ref. All right, so this offset X basically we can use in a style. So transform, which is we're going to use translate 3D. So it accepts X, Y, and Z. So we're just going to override X over here using the offset X. So let's try to run this. And we should remove overflow. And let's make this draggable false. Reason why is because when you try to see, I can drag the image and open a new tab. And then we want to prevent that dragging effect. So you make the image draggable false. Now you cannot drag it anymore. All right, and yep, okay. It is displaying the first image as expected. And this offset X is going to be our UI state to basically move this container of images. So for example, I try to write 500. That's good. It should translate. X. Oh, I forgot to add a pixel over here. Okay. So you see, I pass a 500 and it moved the container of the images. So if I put 800, because that's the container size, it would display the second image or slightly. Okay. Let's see. Oh, because the images are not 100%. That's weird. Container should be. Oh, our container has the 20 padding, so that's why it's 770. So if we put 770, we will display the second image right here. All right, so now you can basically get the idea of how we're going to move the images. So using offset X. Now let's try to add the style. The mouse events. So first I'm going to add an on mouse down. So since this is I'm going to use it over here. Down. Since I'm going to access the event data, I also have to define the type. So this is, since I'm attaching it in a reactive way, we're going to use react.mouse event, and it accepts an argument, which is basically the type of the HTML. So this is a HTML div element. All right, and then let me explain what we need to do. So basically on mouse down, I'm going to record that X. So in the event data, there's a thing what we call client X. So the X position of your mouse cursor. And as I move my mouse, that's also recording another X, which I will deduct from the starting X. So the starting X would come from the mouse down, and the current X would come from the mouse move. So I deduct that, and that would be the difference, or like the distance that I did. So that distance, I'm going to deduct it even further with the offset X. So currently, where's my image position? or like offset 2. And then that's how we eventually get the new offset x. So on mouse down, on mouse up, then we just basically stop listening to the mouse move, and that's where the image will be last positioned. So I hope that explains it. If not, let's start coding and maybe you eventually understand it. So again, I'm going to add current x first. So current x offset x ref. Let's make this 0 again. So we need to record what was the position of our container, the last or the previous position of our container. So in order to get that, we can use the get ref value from the offset x ref. All right, and that's how we basically pass in and update the current offset x. So this is the last position of our Swiper container. And then what we're going to do is basically listen in. We also need to write the start x position. So start x ref. So default value is 0. Get it from the event data client x. All right, so that's about it for it. And we need to add 2 new events. So on mouse move, so event data, and on mouse up. We don't need the event data right here. We need to define this. So I'll just use a regular mouse event because I'm going to attach the events, these 2 events in the window. Mouse move, mouse up. The reason why I attach it in the window is because if we started listening over here, this is the Swiper container, the same width as the Swiper container. If our mouse cursor goes out, it cannot listen to the mouse move anymore because that's outside the Swiper container. And we don't want that to happen because even if we go outside this mouse, as you can see right here, it still continues to move even if I'm outside the container. That's why we need it to attach in the window itself. So because we're not using this event listener in a reactive way, we can just use the generic mouse event, which is available by default. You don't need to import it from anywhere. And yep, we can move on and do the mouse move logic. On mouse up, we just have to remove these event listeners. Right here. Oops. And on the mouse move, what do we need to do? So we get the current x. Current x, yeah. Which is available in the event data client x. Okay. Now we need to deduct current x and start x, which is I save it in a ref. So that's why I can access this over here. So the start x, I can get it using the helper function that we created, get ref value, and pass in start x ref. And the difference for that would be start x minus current x. All right. So now we have the difference or the distance between this, the point that I click, and when I move. So that is the difference. So we can immediately use difference because you see if as I try, you see that it's moving the opposite way and it's not updating the thing. So we need to deduct this diff with the current offset x. So we can get that current offset x here. Let's use it like this. And we can just use this like this. All right. And basically deduct current offset x. Let's define it like this. New offset x. The current offset x you deduct with the diff. All right. And that would be the new offset x. So let's try out. Refresh, and you can see that it follows my mouse cursor. And yeah, that's how we know it's working fine as expected. And you may have noticed when we're moving outside the image, we cannot see any image anymore. We'll be preventing that later on. But yeah, I think we're getting there. So now what we need to do is basically let's support on touch before we add more logics so that we cover the mobile version of this as well. So I'm going to rename on mouse move. Sorry, not rename, but yes, rename this to on touch move. And on touch. Because normally I approach my development in a mobile first approach. So that's why I like to rename it as mobile. And we'll just reuse this same functionalities in the mouse event. So here, on touch start, but on mouse move is the same as well. So here I'm going to add touch move and touch end. All right. And let's ignore the errors for now. And just basically remove event listeners. And okay, so now we have mouse event, but we don't have the touch event. So let's just add touch event over here. And also same thing for the event over here. It should be, so in TypeScript, if you're new to TypeScript, you can have an or condition. So that will be using the pipe character. So you just do it like this. So event data could be touch event or mouse event. So that's how you do conditionals in TypeScript. So this should be a touch event. And now how do we solve this eClientX? So normally I create a function for that. So basically I call it get touch event data. So this accepts the event data. So using these 4 types over here. So touch event and mouse event. Again, there's an or condition for React TypeScript. All right, so I use 4 of them. I basically check because in touch events, they don't have actually the client X directly. They store it in an array called change touches. This is an array of objects which contains the client X. So if change touches exist in the event data, so what I do is basically return the first object of the change touch. That's how I can get the client X from the touch. If not, then just return the normal event data. So this is how I'm going to use it. get touch event data, pass in the E, and now you see that there's no more error for the client X. As you can see, TypeScript is saying that client X doesn't exist in a touch event. All right, so same thing, I'm going to use this over here. So now, if we try it again, it still works as fine for the mouse event. And we can try on the device toolbar. Let me refresh. And yep, you can see that it also works fine. You see that the container is moving. We can actually prevent that by adding a touch action and Y. So basically, only Y-axis actions will have the browser effect. So now you see that it's not moving the container anymore. Because in a mobile browser, they have these special actions when they do touch. So we want to prevent the X-axis from doing those special effects. We only need the Y-axis. Because for X-axis, we handle that. All right, so now mouse down and touch starts are settled. We can move on to add additional conditions to our swiper component. So remember, we don't want users to keep swiping to the left or to the right when there's already no image. So how do we prevent that? So for the first image, we know that the first image is displayed at 0. Let me just show you real quick. You see that the translate 0 displays the first image. But if you go to the right, it increases to a positive value. So basically, we just need to prevent if the new offset X is more than 0, then we should just return 0 as the new offset. So here, we'll call it as max offset X 0. Because it's a positive value, that's why this is the max. So if new offset X is more than the max, then we should make offset X as 0. Let's try that. As you can see, I cannot swipe to the right anymore, but I can still swipe to the going to the left. I mean, don't get confused by that. I'm going to move to the right and it still works. So now we just need to settle this right part. You see there's no image already. And basically how you compute that is basically multiply the number of items you have or the number of images and multiply that with the container. So container is like 770 times 5. So if you see, we calculate 770 times 5. That's a 3,850. If we try to show that here, that's actually displaying none. So basically, we have to minus that with the container size, 770. So if we try 380, that is displaying the last image. So basically multiplying by the number of items and reduce by 1. So how do we get? We can actually get the container size from on touch start. So let me define the container element ref. So when you declare a ref that contains the DOM element, you have to pass null as the default value first, and then you have to pass in the type like this. Yeah. New offset X. This should actually be list, so container ref. So basically this I'm going to pass the ref over here, and that's how you can basically call this get ref value with this, and you can get the container element. So I'm going to get the container element right here. Ref value container ref. Now this would return the HTML element. And how to get the width? The width would be offset width. Let me define another ref, which is the mean offset x. So we have a max offset x. We already know it's 0, but for mean offset x, we have to compute it on touch start. So I don't compute it on the mouse move because mouse move fires a lot of times, and you don't have to always calculate it there. You can just calculate it on touch start. So that's why I do the calculations over here, so that is not affecting the performance. So how do we calculate mean offset x? Again, we basically get the offset width, deduct it with the scroll width. So scroll width is basically the size of this swiper list containing all the images. Remember, we had a scroll over here before we removed the overflow hidden. Now, the size of the scroll, to scroll until the end, this will be the scroll width. So we minus offset width first because we want it to be a negative value. You see that it's a negative value, so that's why the larger number will be on the right side. And now we can use this in right here. Ref value mean offset x ref, and if our new offset x is less than our mean offset x, we just replace that with the mean offset x. So let's give this a shot. I refresh it, and I try to reach at the end. I can't swipe anymore, as you can see. So that logic is covered. So next, what can we do? So you can see when I try to swipe, it doesn't automatically swipe it to the next, like how it does it over here. You see there's a smooth transition to the next image, and I just have to do like a lazy swipe. See, I just have to do like something like this. Of course, if it's too small, it still remains to the current image, but if it's large enough, then it's auto swipes for me, and that's better for user experience as well. So how do we do that? So we're going to use a formula. Now let me just show you real quick. This is the formula that we'll be using. So let me just write it over here. So let's say I want it to swipe to the next image. Let me just show you this first. You already know that the first image is displayed at 0 offset. The next image is the container size in negative value. So we know the container size is 770. And the third image is basically twice of the swiper container width by negative value. And same for this is thrice. It's basically just a multiples of our container width. So how do we get the nearest position of the container width? We can just basically, for example, it is in multiples of 5. We just basically calculate the nearest number of, for example, 5. So for example, I'm number 4. Nearest number will be 5. If I'm 1, 2, then it's nearest to 0, then 5. And for example, it's 9, then it will be 10. So something like this. How do we come up with that? Basically, this is the formula. Map that round. So the offset x would be basically this offset. You divide it with the container width, which is, for example, 5 or 770, then multiply with the container width. So that's how you get the multiple nearest to the multiples of this number right here. So using this formula, let's get the container width first. Value container width ref. I should save this container width as a ref. There we go. I don't have to keep getting it from the DOM element. All right. That should be it. Let's just prepare this container width. All right, that's much cleaner. Now I have the container width over here. Basically, I need to get offset x. So we can access this from this right here. Offset x ref. Now using the formula just now. Around the new offset x divided by container width. Apply it with the container width. Then we just basically set the offset x with this new offset x right here. And oops, let me just charge my laptop. All right. So let's test it out. So you can see if I swipe over here, it moves to the next image. Currently, we don't have transition styles yet, but you can already see that it's working fine. If I just do a little bit, it doesn't move as much. It doesn't move from the current image, but if I move just enough for it to round off to the next, and yep, it works fine. So how do you add styles? So we need to write a state is swiping, and set this is swiping, set is swiping. So currently it's not. And how can we add is swiping on the touch start? And when it ends, into false on touch end. So touch start, swiping is true. On touch end, it's not swiping. So when it is not swiping, then we can add some overrides. So I'll be using a class to define this is swiping. Then we have a swiping class over here. So on my class, let's add a style over here in the swiper list. So transition, transform, duration is less 300 milliseconds. Transition style is out. And if it's swiping, we don't want this position. As you can see, when I'm swiping, I don't like the transition, but if it's not, then it transitions slowly. Maybe I can show you when we just have the transition all the time. You can see, oh, there's an error. We need to import it from React. As you can see, let's try out. You see that the swiping is delayed. That's why we need to prevent that. If we are swiping, then there should be no transition at all. All right, and that should solve it. Now you can see it swipes smoothly for us, and when I let go, then there you go. It's much more smoother. All right, so now that's settled. We still can make improvements to this swiper component. As you can see, if I do like this, it still doesn't move to the next image. I have to like more than half of the container, then it will move to the next image. So we need to make this easier for our users. How do we do that? Basically, we can implement like a lazy kind of swiping. So basically, we don't need more than half. We just need like what I'll be using is 40 pixels, and then it will move to the next image. So something like this. You can see I didn't do much swipe, and it already moves to the next image. So let's do that here. How can we do that? Basically, instead of just map that round, we'll be using map ceiling and that floor. So we just need to determine if it goes to the right, we'll be using map the floor to the right, and to the left is the map the ceiling. So it doesn't need to be round off. It's basically whichever direction you want it to go. So how do we determine the direction? Basically, if the difference is a positive number, means it's going to the right. Going to the right like this. And I reach the right end. And it's going to the left, you know that it's negative. So that's why if the difference is negative, it's going to the left. And if it's positive, then it's going to the right. So that's how we do it. So in code, basically, we get the current offset x from the current offset x. Get the difference between the current offset x and the new offset x. So now I'm going to define the max swipe, minimum swipe required. So that's the 40 pixels that I mentioned. So it doesn't have to be more than half. It's just whether you're more than 40, then you will do the swipe. So this difference will be either positive or negative value. So we have to use absolute so that we always get a positive value of the diff if more than the swipe required. So basically, swipe to the right if diff is positive, and swipe to the left if diff is negative. So this is where we can use the map that ceiling or map that floor. If it's not, then you can just use the round, which is basically if it's less than 40, then it will just stay in its current position because the value is not enough to move to either directions. So here we can check if diff is more than 0, and it's going to the right. Remember, we're just going to replace the round to ceiling. And else here, it's basically going to the left, so you will use floor. So I think that's about it. We can try this out. Remember, this logic happens on the touch end. All right, so let me refresh. And did we miss anything? Current set new offset x more than 0. Let's refresh. Not sure why is that. Oops, sorry, I missed. It should be floor and ceiling. Sorry about that. And yeah, as you can see, I just have to do like this, and you will swipe to the right or left. If I do less than 40, then it stays here in the current image. But if it's more than 40, then yep, you can see that it's so easy to use. That's great. So we're almost done here. So we just have to create this indicator. And then after that, we can start writing tests. So let's create the indicator. So swiper indicator. So the number of indicators is the same number as the images. So we can just loop the indicators right here. Again, we don't need the item actually. Just need it here. Oh, this will be a list item as well. Then we should have a key of the index. This class name should be indicator. This class name should be swiper indicator. All right. So how do we determine if it's the current image? So basically from the index, because arrays works on index. So if it's displaying the first image, then index is 0. So we already can get the index of each indicators when we loop into it. So basically we can have an active class. So before that, we should create a state. Call this current index. Set the current index. So first image index is 0. So 0 is the default value. And we can compare this if index is equal to the current index, and we should add an active class. If not, then there's no active class at all. And we should also add a listener. So let's add it right below on later on click. We'll just pass the index as the number. So basically, when we click this, we should move to the next image. So we need the index value for that. So this one. So let me pass it on here first. On click. Anonymous function to pass in the index. So like this. Indicator on click. Then we pass the index. So anything else we forgot? All right. So when we're doing a swipe, we need to update the current index to the whatever image is currently displayed. So currently, second image is displayed. So the index number 1 should be active. So how do we compute for this? So basically, we can compute it on the touch end and set the current index. So we already know that each offset is a multiples of the container width. So we can just divide new offset x with the container width. And since this is a negative value, this offset x could be a negative value most of the time. We need to make it a positive number because our index works in a positive sign. So we need the positive value for that. So just math that absolute. And then for the indicator click, same thing. So instead of dividing it, you basically multiply the index with the container width. So I'm just going to copy this set the current index to the index being passed, and set the offset x by basically multiplying container with the index. Since in order to move to the left, it should be a negative value, so we just wrap it in a negative sign. So this should work. So let me see. Oh, we forgot to add some styles for the indicator. Let me add it over here. Indicator. Display flex. Justify content to the center. Since this is a style, we don't want this. We don't want these bullets. We want to create our own. And margin should be 50 on top. And just basically set the 0 to the other margins and padding as well. For the swiper indicator item, we want it to have a width of 12, height of 12. Make this circle. Margin should be 4px to the side, so left and right. Background should be default. It's like a slightly grayish. We should have a cursor pointer when we hover onto it. All right, so if this is active, then we should set the background to a slightly darker 777 dark gray. All right, as you can see, it's basically working the same way in our production swiper. And if I click, it goes to the last image. If I click on the first, it goes to the first image. So yep, we're done. But we still have to write tests for it. So we'll get into that. And I hope you learn a lot for this building this swiper component. And let's start to write some tests. So normally when I write tests, I put it in a test folder so that it doesn't mess up our main files. So when we're developing, we don't see the test files. We see it in the test folder. So first, I'm going to write tests for SwiperItem.tsx. So the convention for writing the test file for me, at least, I use .test and then the type of that file, so tsx as well. So now what we're going to do is basically write a describe. So describe is a function in JS. Basically just describe what you're testing. So I'm testing swiper item. So I'm just going to write swiper item right here. And I'm going to import it as well. Swiper item from swiper item. All right. And I also have a props. So I'm going to import it here as well. And normally I create a reusable render component function which accepts the props. That's why I imported it here so that I can pass it here. We can call one of the functions from React testing library. So from this, you have a render function, which basically render your component in a test environment. Here I can just pass swiper item and pass in the props. So you can see that in test files, you also still get TypeScript errors. So I think that's good also, so that we can get some errors even when we're writing tests, and we can catch bugs early on. All right, so that's about it. And to write a test case in a describe block, you can use it, or you can also use test function. So I like to use it. So first, it should render our image props. So it should accept image source and image out props. So how do we check for this? So first we need to generate a random image source and image alternative text. So for that, I'm going to use a library called Faker. So to generate random data for us. This makes our test case more robust because the data is always in random. We don't hard code anything. So we're going to use Faker, and Faker also has a types. I'm using a specific version right here because the developer for Faker messed up the latest version, and yeah, you can check it out. It's quite a funny incident. So, but this is the latest working version, so we'll use this. I'm sorry, I forgot to add yarn add. All right. So let's wait for this to install. So once that's installed, let me just start writing the code. We can generate a random image source using faker.image.image URL. And then the image alternative can be just a sentence. So lorem sentence. All right. So okay. Now let's render the component using our render component function and pass in the props. So image source, image alternative. So now in this test case, our component gets rendered. So what check can we do? So in the same testing library by React, there's actually what we call the screen, which we can query the DOM element. So there's a lot of query right here. So there's query by alt text, which you're going to use. There's other things like display value, label text, placeholder, role, test ID, text, title. So we can use a lot of queries. But for now, we're just going to query by alt text. We already know what the alt text is. This is going to be the image element. And for this, after we query, we basically check whether this image element that we query exists and has a image source same as what we pass in the props. So there's another function by Jess, which is expect. This is basically like a verification whether what we expect is there. So we expect image element, then there's a matcher function returned by the expect. So dot to have an attribute. So there's a lot of matcher functions like to be in the document, to have a class, to have a style. So for this, we're just going to have the attribute check source, compare it with our current source that we pass. So basically, when we render the component, we query whether that alternative text is there, and we check whether that image element returned by the query has a source of image source. Basically, that's our verification that this component is working fine as expected. So to check, I'm going to run in our terminal yarn test, and I like to pass coverage so that we can see how much it covers the file component. So it also helps us to see what are the uncovered lines. As you can see, our first test case already achieved 100% coverage. That's great. But I cannot promise you the same thing for SwiperItem. I mean the Swiper component, because there's a lot of logic into that. So basically we're done with this swiper item. We can move on to a more complicated one, which is Swiper.tsx. So again, I'm going to do the same thing. Import swiper and do a describe block. And same thing, I like to create a reusable function. Reason being, if I have this render in each test case again and again, when I change the file name, then it will become harder to replace. So having it here at the top makes it easier to make changes. And same thing for props. And if this props changes, we don't have to keep changing it on all the test case. We can just change this here on the top. All right, so props, import from Swiper, and then the render by testing library by React. And just pass the props over here. So for this, we basically check whether the images are displayed. So we can do the same check that we did in the swiper item. And it should display this. Again, we're going to use Faker to generate the fake images for us. So our swiper component accepts a number of items. So a number of images, not just one. So I'm also going to pass an array of items. So what I like to do is basically create random images function right here. So to me, I think 3 is enough. I don't think more than this is necessary, but you can change this if you want. Basically, I want to compose an array of images. So let's just do a for loop. Oops, sorry. Pass in basically same thing as we did over here. We generated the image source and image alternative. Do over here as well. Let's make this bigger. So now that it goes through, loops through, and returns you the items. So now I can just basically call this. We can render our components. All right, so how can we check whether the images are displayed? So we can actually loop through this. And this will return us the item or the image. And remember how we check this image element? We can actually reuse it here as well. So screen by, let's import it here. And this item has an image alternative text. And once we query that, we should check whether the source is the same. All right, so once I save this, this should still pass. Great. So now you can see how many uncovered lines are there. Oops, sorry. So 26 to 41, 44 to 70. So when we look at our Swiper.tsx, we go to line 26. This is the touch move to 41. And this is the touch end. So basically this is the swiper logic because we haven't done anything to test that. And that's what we're going to do now. So it should swipe icons on mouse move. So I'm going to do mouse first, and we can do the touch later. where they're basically the same test case, but just different events fired in the test environment. And also, before we start writing tests, I just want to create another helper for our test. So I'm going to create a file called testhelpers.ts. Let me explain to you why. So, in a normal browser, we have things such as offset width, scroll width. So this actually just these two things, we already use it to compute the container width and the scroll width to compute the minimum offset x. So these are parts of our swiping logic, right? But in a test environment, these values are actually 0 because these are actually computed with your CSS styles in the browser. But in test environment, it's always 0. And that could be a problem for us because how do we then verify that our swiping logic is working if it's always 0? All of your results would just be 0, and that's not really reliable. So what we can do is basically override this offset width and scroll width with the number that we desire or want to use. So it would have been easy if we just use element that offset width, then just define our own number. But these properties are read-only properties, and you cannot easily do it. So we have to create a helper function in order to override these values. So I'm going to create a function set read-only property, and let's just add the arguments first. So it accepts an object and then a property of that object and the new value that I want to override. Let's ignore the TypeScript for now. And then I'm going to call object define property, passing the object that we from the argument and the property. And then this accepts the value and it is configurable true. All right, so this basically just overrides a read-only property. And again, I can use a generic because these objects and properties can be any of value. So again, I'm going to have O as the object, P as the property, V as the value. And we can actually do an extension. So, similar in JavaScript, we have class and we can extend a class. In TypeScript, it works the same. We can extend a generic and we expect this object to be an object. So there's this thing what we call record. It's basically like an object which then accepts two arguments. So object has a property. So the property naming, we want it to be a string. And the value of that property can be anything. Again, this property, this should be a key of, and again, this is a feature in TypeScript. So basically, P is a key of O. So basically, if we try to pass anything that doesn't exist in O, you would get a TypeScript error. Later, I'm going to show you an example. So in this V, we just extend it as any. So yeah, this is done. We just have to pass in the generics to each of the arguments. And now we can reuse this. So again, we can use the same thing over here. And these values, we need to override the offset width and scroll width our container element, right? So how do we get our container element? Or actually, it should be list element. You can use again the screen and query. By this time, we can query by role. So role is basically area roles, in web development. So there's different kinds of role. So there's a list role. Oops, where is it? Yeah, here. So basically, unordered list automatically has this role. So that's why we can query for it. And we can't just straight away use query by role. You can see I try to do this. I'll get a JS error right here because there's two unordered lists in our swiper item. So the list for the images and the list for the indicators. So instead of using query by row, you can query all by row. And we just need the first item. And that's how we get our list container. And let's generate a container with this. We'll use the faker data type and number. So this will generate a random number and we can pass a minimum value for it. So we don't want 0, so we'll add 1, minimum of 1. And how do we compute for the scroll width? It's basically container width multiplied by the number of items. All right. So now that we have the container width and container scroll width, we'll just override it using our property set width only property, passing the object, which is the list element in this case, property container width. Just duplicate that for the scroll width. Oops. This is the scroll width. This is actually offset X, offset width. As you can see, just now I tried to pass in a property that doesn't exist in list element, and I get a TypeScript error because I'm using the key of. So that's why it's very useful for this case. All right, now that we already override it, we can now do some checks. So first thing we need to check whether our list element, we expect our list element to be positioned to display the first image. So how do we check that? We can use to have style, and basically he accepts an object like a style object in React, and we want 3D XYZ. I think that's just it. So if it's 0, it should be displaying the first image. So let's check whether that's correct. Oh, sorry. It should be translate 3D. All right, and that should pass our test. So basically, the starting position is 0. All right. Now, let's execute some mouse events. How do we do that? So again, there's another function from React testing library, which is fire events. This is the function to trigger different kinds of DOM elements. So not just mouse events, you can trigger touch events, you can trigger scroll, and different kinds of DOM events. And yeah, I'm going to show you how to fire a mouse event. So first we have 3 different kinds of mouse events. So first we do a mouse down, and then we mouse move, and then we mouse up, right? So let's pass in. It accepts the first argument as the element that you want the event to get triggered. All right. So in this mouse down and mouse move, we actually use the client X or the X position. So we can pass it here as an option. So basically you can add values to the event data. So I'm going to define a Start x over here, 0. So we start at 0, so that's easier to digest. And then in order to move the images, it should be more than 40. Remember the swiper, the minimum swipe should be 40. So our nx should be -41. Because we want to move to the left, it should be a negative value. So we just pass it over here as a client x. And same thing for mouse move. That will be our nx. So now that we triggered these events to the list element, we can do a verification again. So now it should not be 0. It should move to the next image or the second image. So what is the position of the second image? It's a negative value of the container width. So times 1 of the container width. All right, and it should be a negative since we're moving to the left. And this should pass. So verify it should move to the left. All right, let's check whether our test pass. And yes, indeed, it passed. And you see that the uncovered lines change and our coverage increased. That's great. And since if we check the uncovered lines again, line 34, it's basically it shouldn't move to the edges. We move to the 38, same thing, 57 to 60. So this is the one that I wanted to see. So you were able to move from left to the right, but we haven't covered the opposite side. So we can do the same thing again. So normally I like to create a separate test case for this, but I think this is a special case that makes sense because we already moved to the left. By right, we should move to the right. We don't have to repeat this code in order to just cover a separate test case. So that's why I think we can just continue from here and do the checks. Although it's advisable to have separate test cases in a different scenario, not this, because it makes it easier to maintain. And also when you have a lot of expectation, then the test case becomes more complicated and hard to understand. Like imagine you have a lot of code and you have to read that bunch of code. So if it's like this, then you see that one test case has a small test, one expect only, and that's easier to understand. Yeah. But for this case, this is a special case, which I think makes more sense. All right. So now instead of negative value, we just make it a positive value. And we expect it to go back to 0 again. So we should move to the right. Okay. Once we save this, it should still pass again. And it did. And you see that that's the line 57 is now over there. And how about line number 60? So again, we can do the same thing. So basically, for line number 60, it should stay if it's less than our minimum swipe required, so less than 40. So we can do that. Just copy again this code right here. So it should verify should stay in position if less than minimum. Or yeah. All right. So what we can do here, we can use Faker to generate a number for us that's minimum of 0 and maximum of 40. So since our minimum required should be more than 40, so any number within this range would just stay on the same position as the previous one. Let's try that. All right, and you see that we are getting lesser uncovered lines, and line number 60 is not here anymore. That's great. So what else can we cover? So line number 38 is basically, if it's already the first image, then it shouldn't go to the left side. So let's try to cover that. Basically, hold on. Actually, this should be a negative value. We're trying to move to the left. Yeah. All right. Now let's try to move the items. See that 34 appeared, which what I was trying to test. So for this, we just need like 1. Try to move to the right even further, but it should still stay. And this should pass. Verify. Shouldn't move to the right if already at the start. Yep. So what about the other side? So what if we want to test this part? So we can calculate for the mean offset in this case. So how do we compute for that? Basically just container width minus container scroll width. All right, that is the minimum offset. This is the minimum offset displaying the last image. So again, copy this. Event trigger, and we want to be able to this is a negative value to move to the left. This is moving to the right. It's moving to the left with a negative value. We just add a +1. And again, it should stay to the minimum offset X. So we added a +1 here, but the image shouldn't move beyond that. So it shouldn't move further to the left. We've already at the end. All right, oops, why did that fail? Let me rerun again. This element, container scroll width, oops, sorry, it should be container scroll width minus. Yeah, because this is a positive value. Then we convert it to negative over here. And now we check what is this line 94 to 98. It's actually the indicator on click. We didn't do any test case to trigger the indicator on click. And if we check 1, 2, 3 is the same. Line 1, 2, 3 is the on click. But before we move to that, I just want to show you that we haven't covered the touch events. So I'm just going to copy our mouse test case. And it should swipe items, sorry, swipe items. It should swipe items on touch move. So how do we convert this test case? Oops, sorry, there's a lot of lines into mobile. So basically just replace this tree right here. So touch start, remember our events, touch move and touch end. And there's actually no client X in touch devices. It's an object. So same thing for this. And then just copy everything from here. All right. Yeah, funny thing. Not really okay. Next, sorry. should be nx. All right, so that should pass. And yep, everything still passed and still looking green for us. We're just left with the uncovered lines. So let's cover that. So for our next test case, it should swipe items on indicator click. For this, I'm just going to copy the same thing we did to override. Okay, this part right here. Copy it here. Okay. So again, we can still do the same check. That the position is at the start. Position 0, starting position. And how do we check whether the indicators are working fine? So we know that the first image is displayed. So the first item in the indicator should be or should have a class of active. So how do we do that? Basically, let's get the first indicator element. And we cannot simply just use query by role. So I'm going to show you how to use the data test ID. Here I added an attribute so that we can query the indicators more easily in JS. I mean in our test case. So here we can query all because all of them have the same test ID by test ID and indicator. All right, so the first item has an index of 0. So we expect the first indicator to have a class of active. Let's try and save this and check our test case. It failed. How come? Because this is not test ID. Oh, I forgot to save the changes over here. That should work fine now. And it did. And now, let's query for the second indicator element, which is in index 1. So this one, we expect it to not have. So you can use expect but not. So basically the opposite of to have class. So the second indicator should not have an active class. All right. Now we can fire an event. So here we're doing a click event and passing the element that we want the event to get triggered. Now when this is clicked, we basically do the swap of checking. So now the second should have the indicator, second item, while the first should not have an active class. All right, and that should still pass. And just as an additional check, we should verify that the position move should move to the left. So just an extra precaution that when you do the indicator click, it should move to the left. So ×1 of the container width in negative value. And this should pass. All right, and we achieved 100% coverage for Swiper and SwiperItem component. And yeah, that's actually all for now for this video. And I actually want to challenge you to extend this component because I actually didn't add the arrow functions over here. You can try that. And yeah, I hope you learned a lot from this video, and don't forget to subscribe and like and share this video. So I'll see you again, and thank you for your time. So bye.